workshop was dimly lit, save for the halo of light cast by the magnifying lamp above the workbench. The smell of oil, brass, and old wood filled the air. Jacob Hayes, a solitary watchmaker in his late 40s, hunched over the table, his hands steady and precise despite the lateness of the hour. On the bench before him lay a peculiar pocket watch, its once gleaming case tarnished and dented. He'd found it at an estate sale, buried among a heap of forgotten relics. Something about it had called to him. Its weight in his palm, the intricate engraving of a serpent devouring its own tail on the back, the Ouroboros. Jacob had spent hours dismantling it, marveling at the craftsmanship. Every gear, every cog was impossibly delicate, beyond the skill of most modern watchmakers. Now, with its mechanisms restored, he wound it carefully. The click of the winding stem echoed in the stillness. The watch began to tick, but backward. Jacob frowned. He tapped the glass face, shook it gently. The second hand continued its reverse path. Intrigued, he set the watch to his bedside table, resolving to investigate further in the morning. The next day, Jacob woke feeling oddly refreshed. For the first time in years, his joints didn't ache. His reflection in the mirror startled him. The gray at his temples seemed lighter, his skin smoother. Shaking off the strange observation, he returned to his workshop. Over the following days, Jacob grew obsessed with the watch. He carried it with him, studying its backward motion, its impossible precision. To his astonishment, the backward ticking seemed to correspond to his own body. The lines around his eyes softened, his eyesight sharpened, even his memory improved, at least at first. One night, while adjusting the watch's minute hand, Jacob noticed something odd. His workshop window overlooked the narrow street below, where the lamplight pooled in warm golden circles. He'd spent countless evenings observing the same scene, yet now it felt unfamiliar, as though the street itself had shifted in some imperceptible way. The next morning, the feeling grew worse. As Jacob sipped his coffee, he stared at the corner where the old bakery stood, puzzled. He could swear it had always been painted blue, but now it was red. Had the baker redecorated, or had it always been red, and he'd simply remembered it wrong? More discrepancies followed. His favorite diner had a different waitress, one he didn't recognize but who greeted him by name. The park bench where he often ate lunch had disappeared entirely, replaced by a gnarled oak tree. The changes were small, subtle, but enough to unsettle him. Jacob began to notice gaps in his memory, not just forgetfulness. Whole moments felt stolen. Once, while repairing a client's wristwatch, he blinked and found himself standing by the window, the watch still untouched. Another time he woke in his workshop at midnight, unsure how he'd gotten there. At first he rationalized it as stress or fatigue, but the unease gnawed at him. The watch, he suspected, was to blame. Just a coincidence, he muttered to himself, but his voice wavered. Despite his growing dread, he couldn't part with the watch. He had begun to look younger, he couldn't deny it. His hair darkened, his wrinkles vanished. His hands, once marred by decades of work, were smooth and steady as they'd been in his 20s, but the trade-off was becoming clearer. The dreams began soon after, dreams of unfamiliar places and faces. He dreamt of a woman with fiery red hair, laughing as she painted a mural on a brick wall. He dreamt of a little boy running barefoot through a meadow, his outstretched arms clutching a paper airplane. He dreamt of war-torn streets, the air thick with smoke, as he clutched a gun he'd never owned. When Jacob woke, the dreams lingered, vivid and haunting. He could recall their scents, sounds, and colors with perfect clarity. Yet he didn't know these people or places. Had he invented them, or had they been taken from someone else? By now, Jacob's life was unraveling. His reflection in the mirror revealed a man at least 10 years younger, yet he felt hollow. The more the watch ticked, the more his own memories seemed to dissolve, replaced by fragments of lives he'd never lived. One evening, he wandered the streets of his town, hoping to clear his head. The familiar streets had become alien, the faces of neighbors unrecognizable. A growing sense of isolation gripped him. He no longer belonged here or anywhere. He found himself in a bar he didn't remember entering, nursing a glass of whiskey. Across the room, a man in a worn coat was staring at him. When their eyes met, the man approached. "Nice watch," he said, his voice low. "Where'd you get it?" Jacob tensed. "Why?" The man leaned in close, his breath heavy with alcohol. "That watch doesn't belong to you. It never did. Best get rid of it before it gets rid of you." Jacob stumbled back, clutching the watch in his pocket. "What are you talking about?" But the man only smiled sadly. "Borrowed time always runs out." Jacob rushed home, the man's words ringing in his ears. He locked the door behind him, his chest heaving. Sitting at his workbench, he placed the pocket watch before him. He wanted to destroy it. He tried smashing it with a hammer, but the metal remained unscathed. He tried prying it open, yet the case resisted. Desperation mounting, he hurled it against the wall, but it simply rolled to a stop, ticking backward. The sound of the ticking filled the room, growing louder, faster. Jacob clutched his head, trying to block it out, but it was inside him now, resonating in his skull. The next morning, Jacob awoke to a stranger's face in the mirror. The man staring back at him was young, his skin taut and unblemished, his hair thick and dark, yet his eyes were haunted, empty. His workshop was unfamiliar, filled with tools and trinkets he didn't recognize. The town outside his window was bustling and modern, nothing like the quaint streets he'd known. Panic surged as he realized he no longer remembered his own name. The pocket watch rested on the table, its Ouroboros engraving glinting in the morning light. He picked it up, staring into the reflection of the serpent devouring itself. The watch was silent now, its hands frozen. Jacob, or whoever he was now, felt a cold emptiness settle in his chest. The watch had granted him youth, but it had taken everything else, his memories, his identity, his life. He was a stranger in a world that wasn't his, and the watch had moved on. Somewhere, in another forgotten shop or estate sale, another hand would lift the tarnished timepiece, drawn to its weight, its beauty. They would wind it, marvel at its backward tick, and they too would pay the price. Thank you for joining me this evening. Before you go, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. If you have an idea for a short, scary story, leave it in the comments below. See you at the next campfire. Michael's house was old, almost as old as the memories he clung to, though those memories felt more like weights than treasures. The house, much like his life, was cluttered, filled with remnants of dreams that never blossomed. The flickering light from a dusty lamp barely illuminated the living room, casting long shadows across worn-out furniture. Michael sat slumped in his armchair, staring blankly at the muted television. His days were monotonous, each blending into the next, filled with the hum of nothingness. He hadn't left the house in days, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. The walls creaked with age, a house settling into the earth, but tonight, something was different. The sounds seemed closer, more deliberate, as though the house itself was whispering to him. He dismissed it as the wind, though there was no wind tonight. As the clock struck midnight, Michael heard it for the first time, a faint whisper from the basement, barely audible but unmistakably calling his name. Michael. He sat up, heart pounding. The voice was soft, almost tender, yet it sent chills down his spine. He shook his head, convincing himself it was just his mind playing tricks. Yet, the whisper lingered, threading through the silence like a forgotten melody. The next night, the whispers returned, more persistent, more desperate. They beckoned him, coaxing him out of his lethargy. Michael tried to ignore them, but curiosity gnawed at him. What could be making those sounds? Reluctantly, he descended into the basement, each step creaking under his weight. The air grew colder with each step, the kind of cold that burrowed into your bones. At the bottom, he stood in the dim glow of a single bare bulb. scanning the familiar walls of peeling paint and shelves lined with dusty boxes. And then he saw it, a door. It stood in the far corner, where there had never been one before. The wood was dark and ancient, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under his gaze. A metallic, rusted doorknob glinted in the dim light, almost beckoning him to touch it. Michael approached cautiously, his breath shallow. The whisper stopped the moment he laid his hand on the doorknob. He twisted it, but it was locked, as though mocking his attempt to enter. He stepped back, trembling, the silence now deafening. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder. They invaded his dreams, turning sleep into a battleground of restless thoughts and shadowy figures. He heard them in the daylight, weaving through the mundane noise of his life, making his solitude unbearable. His anxiety escalated, each whisper a needle threading through his sanity. Michael became obsessed with the door, spending hours in the basement, watching it, waiting for something to happen. His reflection on his failures sharpened during these vigils, the career he never pursued, the love he let slip away, the chances he was too afraid to take. Every whisper was a reminder of what could have been. One night, after another torturous evening of whispers and regret, Michael couldn't take it anymore. He rummaged through the basement, pulling open old drawers and boxes until he found an ancient-looking key. It was heavy, cold to the touch, and somehow he knew it belonged to the door. With trembling hands, he inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed through the still air, louder than thunder in the quiet. He opened the door slowly, revealing a dark corridor that seemed to stretch into nothingness. A cold draft rushed out, extinguishing the basement light, plunging him into darkness. But he didn't turn back. He stepped through. On the other side, the air was different, still, heavy with a sense of timelessness. Michael emerged into what seemed like his house, but everything was slightly off. The furniture was newer, the walls freshly painted, and the air smelled of lavender, not mildew. He walked through the rooms, each step filling him with unease. There were pictures on the walls of a life he didn't recognize, photos of himself smiling, happy, with a woman he once loved but lost. In these pictures, they were together, their eyes shining with a joy that had long since left his own. He found a study, a place where his alternate self worked. On the desk were awards and certificates, accolades for achievements he had never attained but once dreamed of. The whispers had brought him here, to a life that was everything he had ever wanted, but had never dared to reach for. As he moved through this perfect world, Michael felt the weight of his own life crushing down on him. He realized that this place wasn't a dream, it was a taunt, a cruel manifestation of what he could have been. Then he saw him, the alternate Michael, sitting in the living room, content and unaware of the visitor. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from the very walls, the very air, urging him to stay. "Stay," they pleaded. "This can be yours." But it was a lie, wasn't it? This life wasn't his, could never be his. It was a cruel trick of fate, a ghostly echo of what might have been. Michael stood at the threshold, torn between the suffocating reality he knew and the seductive lie of this alternate life. The pull was strong, almost irresistible. He wanted to step into this world, to leave behind the crushing weight of his real life, but he knew it would never be real. He stumbled back towards the door, the whispers turning to desperate screams, trying to pull him back. His heart pounded as he crossed the threshold again, slamming the door behind him, trapping the perfect life on the other side. Michael was back in his basement, the familiar cold and darkness surrounding him. But something was different now. Something inside him had broken irreparably. He felt hollow, consumed by the knowledge of what he had lost, of what he could never have. The door remained, silent now, but its presence was a constant reminder of the life he had glimpsed but could never live. The whispers might have stopped, but their echoes remained, reverberating through his mind, poisoning every moment with regret. Michael sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of his failure, the oppressive darkness closing in around him. He was trapped, not by the door, but by his own regret, lost between the life he had and the one he could never have. And as the last light flickered out in the basement, Michael knew he would never escape. The forgotten door had taken everything from him. Thank you for joining me this evening. Before you go, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. If you have an idea for a short scary story, leave it in the comments below. See you at the next campfire. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown field. The summer heat was suffocating, making the air shimmer. A group of 5 friends stood in a loose circle, nostalgia heavy in their hearts. They hadn't been together in years, yet the pull of their shared past had brought them back to this forgotten place. "It's just as we left it," murmured Emma, wiping sweat from her brow and gazing at the gnarled oak tree that stood sentinel over their childhood time capsule. 20 years, sighed Daniel, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Feels like a lifetime." "Or several," quipped Laura, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. She, like the others, felt the strange weight of time pressing down on her. They had all changed. Daniel's hair had thinned, Emma's eyes were rimmed with lines. Laura had a scar running along her left cheek that hadn't been there before. Only Marcus and Peter seemed untouched by the years, but even they carried the invisible burdens of time. "All right," Peter said, attempting to shake off the unease. "Let's dig it up." The group moved mechanically, their laughter forced as they uncovered the rusty metal box buried beneath the oak. The lock was brittle, and with a single twist, it gave way. Inside the box, the items lay untouched, as if preserved by some unseen force. An old Polaroid camera, trinkets from their childhood, and a handful of letters, yellowed with age. "I can't believe this is still here," Emma said, picking up a small plastic dinosaur. "We were such kids." "Yeah," Marcus said, reaching for the camera. "Remember how we took all those photos before we buried it? We wanted to capture everything." "Let's look at them," Daniel suggested, though his voice carried a hint of reluctance. Marcus snapped the camera open, pulling out the stack of photographs. They were faded, the edges curling, but the images were still clear. "Here's us in front of the oak," Laura said, pointing to a photo. "And here's Daniel tripping over his own feet." Laughter rippled through the group, genuine this time, until Emma pulled out a photo of a small, charred building. "I don't remember this," she said, frowning. The others gathered around. "Neither do I," Marcus said. "Why would we take a picture of something like that?" "That's strange," Peter said, flipping to the next photo. It showed a car accident, the metal twisted and crumpled. "What the hell?" Laura whispered. "Did we take these?" The mood shifted. The warm nostalgia was replaced with a creeping dread. Each photo they flipped through showed scenes of destruction, despair, and disturbingly, familiarity. The next photo made Emma gasp. It was a picture of a woman standing on the edge of a cliff. Her back was to the camera, but the clothes and posture were unmistakable. "That's me," Emma said, her voice trembling. "No, it can't be," Daniel said, though his face had gone pale. "These are just coincidences." "Coincidences?" Marcus snapped. "That's clearly Emma. And this." He pulled out another photo, showing a man with a scar on his cheek, laying motionless in a dark alley. "That's you, Laura." Laura backed away, shaking her head. "This is insane. We were kids. We didn't take these photos." Peter's hands trembled as he held up the last photo. It was an image of 5 tombstones, each bearing their names. "It's some sick joke," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Who would do this?" Emma whispered, tears in her eyes. "I don't know," Daniel said. "But we need to leave." Over the next few days, the friends tried to go back to their lives, but the photos haunted them. Emma couldn't stop thinking about the cliff. She stopped going near the sea altogether. Laura avoided dark alleys. Daniel became reclusive, his mind unraveling with each passing hour. The worst was Marcus, who couldn't stop flipping through the photos, obsessing over each detail, each face. He swore he could see their futures in the shadows. "It's happening," he said during a late-night call with Peter. "I can feel it. We're cursed." "You're being ridiculous," Peter replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "They're just photos." "Are they?" Marcus hissed. "Then why do I dream about them every night? Why do I see us dying in every reflection?" Peter had no answer. He too had started to notice strange things. The shadows in his room seemed darker, the silence heavier. The first tragedy struck with Laura. She was found in an alley near her apartment, her body twisted in a way that mirrored the photograph. The news hit them like a hammer. "It's begun," Marcus said grimly. Emma sobbed into the phone, her voice barely audible. "We have to stop it, we have to." "How?" Daniel asked. "You think we can just undo whatever this is?" "We have to try," Peter said, though his voice was hollow. He didn't believe it, but desperation drove them. They returned to the field, hoping to find answers. The oak tree loomed over them, its branches bare despite the summer. They dug around the spot where the time capsule had been, hoping for a clue, anything to explain the photos. "There's nothing here," Daniel said, throwing down the shovel. "We're digging up ghosts." Emma fell to her knees, clutching the photograph of her on the cliff. "I don't want to die. I don't want to die." Peter knelt beside her. "We'll figure something out." "It's too late," Marcus said, staring at the ground. The photos were just the beginning, their prophecies. "No," Daniel said, his voice rising. "I won't accept that." Emma was next. Despite her efforts to avoid the sea, she was found at the base of a cliff, the waves washing over her lifeless body. Her death sent shockwaves through the remaining friends, their grip on reality slipping. Daniel descended into madness, barricading himself in his apartment, refusing to answer calls. When Peter and Marcus broke down his door, they found him hanging from the ceiling, his face twisted in terror. "This isn't happening," Peter whispered, his hands shaking. "It can't be real." "It is," Marcus said, his voice dead. "We're next." Peter and Marcus spent their final days together, unable to escape the creeping doom. They tried to burn the photos to destroy the evidence, but the images remained, burned into their minds. "What do we do?" Peter asked one night, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling. "There's nothing we can do," Marcus replied. "We were doomed the moment we opened that box." Peter laughed bitterly. "So this is it. We die because of a stupid time capsule, because of what it contained," Marcus corrected. The next morning, Peter woke to find Marcus gone. He found him under the oak tree, lifeless, his face peaceful for the first time in days. A single photograph lay on his chest, the last of the 5 tombstones, now with only one name left untouched. Peter returned to the city, waiting for the end. He wandered the streets, aimless, his mind fractured. The world felt hollow, as if drained of color and life. He knew his time was near. One night, he found himself in a cemetery, drawn there by some unseen force. He wandered until he found the 5 tombstones, just as they had appeared in the photograph. His own grave lay open, waiting for him. Peter collapsed to his knees, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "So this is how it ends," he whispered to the void. As the darkness closed in around him, he saw the faces of his friends, their eyes hollow, their lips moving in silent whispers. They had all been called home, and now it was his turn. The last photograph fluttered down, landing softly on the ground, the final prophecy fulfilled. Thank you for joining me this evening. Before you go, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. If you have an idea for a short, scary story, leave it in the comments below. See you at the next campfire.